Hello everyone, this is Barefoot Mapmaker. I'm going to go through a tutorial on how to make polyobject doors in Ultimate Doom Builder for GZDoom. I'm only going to make one type. I'm going to stick very much to the basics on how to do it and try to explain everything that I'm doing step by step in an easy way or in a way that's easy to understand. So I've already begun with a map, with a basic map. There's my player one start. And as my last video, I set all of my sector brightnesses to 32, so it makes it easier for editing for me, and put a couple of dynamic lights in there. And I've already set up a doorway in here that we're going to place the poly objects in. All right, so the setup is there. Now, how do I make my poly objects? There's another video about this that was made about 15 years ago. This fellow made a video which was pretty good. But I think that it could probably be explained just a little bit better, and that's what I'm going to attempt to do here. So, my poly object is, or my two poly objects are going to have to span this section here. And this section here is 256 map units wide. So I'm going to need two poly objects, or I could have one if I wanted to, 256 pixel wide. But for the sake of ease, we're going to have two. Or for the sake of clarity, we're going to have two. So let's go into vertices mode. All right, I'm going to make a control sector out here. I always call these guys control sectors. Just kind of habit on my part. Okay, now we know that the poly objects are going to have to span 256, so I'm going to make my control sector an extra 64 pixels wide. And I'll explain why in just a moment. Now, one thing that's very important is the sector height, the floor and ceiling height have to be the same as the height in the sector you want the poly objects to appear in game. So right now we got 0 and 128, and here we got 0 and 128. This is very important, and I'll explain that in just a moment. So now I'm going to draw my poly objects, or the things that are going to be my poly objects. Okay, the section we're going to go to is 16 pixels from top to bottom, or from back to front. So we're going to have to make two sectors in my control sector, 16 by 128. And 16 by 128. My sector's created. Now I'm going to delete them. All right. So if I go into visual mode now, I have two sets of lines, two sets of 4 lines that are basically textureless. Those are going to ultimately be the poly objects. Now that I'm in visual mode and you're seeing this, the reason that the control sector has to be the same height as the sector the poly objects are going to render in is for proper texture alignment. So let's go ahead and put some textures on these, and I'll show you why. Let's go for some basic door textures here. Since we're using gray, we'll go ahead and stick with the gray doors here. All right. Now let's see what happens when, or let's say for instance, I make this shorter. You see what happens to those textures? They get clipped off. And what would happen here is when these poly objects were rendered here, they would span from the floor to the ceiling. Okay, because basically they're just sets of lines that are being rendered. It's a poly object, which means it's not an actual object. It's a kind of a fake object. I don't really understand where the vernacular for it came from, but that's pretty much what it means. So what would happen is that texture would tile. You'd get part of the texture down here, and then the rest of the texture up here, and there'd be a break line right here. So your containing sector has to be the exact same height as the sectors the polyobjects are going to appear in. Okay? That's very important. Very, very important. Now I'm going to put some textures here. Let's put some door textures in there. Just go ahead and put just a couple of these. All right. Now that's all the texturing that we're going to do. The texturing for the polyobjects is complete. All right, now then, we're going to do the polyobject setup now. Line. Here is your polyobject start line or control line. I like to call it a control line. In UDB, it's called start line. It's number 1 in the actions. Polyobject start line. I call it the polyobject control line. And since this is going to be the first one, we're going to call it 1. And the second one is going to be number 2. We're going to mirror it because these doors are going to open side to side. They're going to split apart and all that kind of good stuff. All right. So we've got that start line set up. And now this start line is going to be action number 1, polyobject number 2, mirroring polyobject number 1. Now you can make sound sequences for these. I'm not going to get into that here. These doors are going to be silent in play because there's not a sound sequence set up for them. But you can create a sound sequence and assign that to that. That's more advanced stuff that I'm just not going to get into with this tutorial. All right, now we have the start line set up. Now we need to put in our anchors. Polyobject anchors are thing number 9300. Polyobject anchor. Now, here's where it gets a little strange. You assign the polyobject the number that it's going to be by selecting the angle, and then it's inserting the number that the polyobject is. Okay, so the angle on that is number 1. I wish they would change that in UDB, but it's been that way for years, and I don't really see them changing it. Okay, that polyobject anchor's number has to match the line the polyobject's in. Okay, some people put it on the line. I like to put it in the center of the polyobject that I'm making just to keep things consistent. You can pretty much put it anywhere that you want in here, but it affects where the polyobject appears in map, so I always put it in the center. That's just how I like to do things. Okay, and this one here is going to be polyobject number 2. Now we're going to put the polyobject start spots. Okay, turn my brightness off, and I'm going to put a vertex right here so that I get an indication of where the center of these 2 lines are. And the reason for that is my polyobject start spots, which is 9301. Polyobject start spot. Now you can select other types. Polyobject start spot crush hurts the touch. Okay, you can do either one of those. I'm just going to do start spot for the purpose of this tutorial. And that has to be number 1. And you see it draws a line between the 2. And this is going to be start spot number 2. All right. Now this containing sector, this control sector, can be pretty much anywhere that you want it to be, but it cannot be in the map. It has to be out of your play area. Players should never be able to see it. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and move to the next step. Moving the poly objects. What do we want them to do? Okay. Well, we're going to start here. Actually, we want to highlight both these lines because we want to move through them one way and then the other. All right. Let's see here. Poly object. Door slide. Poly object number 1. Let's go ahead and have it go turbo because poly objects move slower than regular doors. I'm not really too sure why, but they do. So I always select a faster speed for them. All right, we set the movement of travel or the direction of travel. The door is going to slide that way. All right. And how many map units we want it to travel. 124. The polyobject is 128. If you have it move 128, its facing line over here will vanish into the wall. And we don't want that. So we want it to move 124 so you got a little bit of door sticking out of the wall. When player presses use, and we're going to make it a repeatable action. Okay, both those lines do this. All right. Now we're going to do the same thing for the other. Now let's reiterate. This is polyobject number 1. This controls polyobject number 1. Clear. Now we're going to do the same thing over here, except the exact opposite. Polyobject door slide. Polyobject number 2. Have it go turbo. This is very important. You have to set the same speed. Movement angle, that's already correct. We're going to have that door slide this way. We're going to have it go 124. You'll notice too that I didn't set the seconds. Let's go ahead and do that now. Let's set it for 6 seconds. The door stays open for a little bit. When player presses use and repeatable. Okay. Now we're going to clear that and set this to 6 seconds too. This is very important. It has to be mirrored exactly. Otherwise, the doors will get out of sync when they're moving. You know, they'll open together, but then they won't close at the same time. So it'll look a little strange. So you need to make sure all that's done. Now that's pretty much all there is to it. It's done. So let's go ahead and run it and see how it looks. I'm sorry about the Dragon Sector load screen. I'm using those resources, so because I didn't feel like going through the process of switching everything out. And there's my polyobject door. See? It moved on its own. Now in 6 seconds, it's going to close again. How about that? Move to the other side. And it closes again, or it opens again. Now, remember the mirroring that I set up. I've been clicking on this door to open it. Now I can move over here and do the same thing here. And that door will follow suit. It'll mirror what that door did. All right, let's go ahead and exit out. And just to reiterate a couple of points, the control sector for your polyobjects have to be the exact same height as the sector that the polyobjects are going to appear in. That's vitally important. That has to be the case all the time when you're making polyobjects. The sector values don't have to be the same. It's like, for instance, you can make this 128 by 256 as long as it's 128 map units high, the same as what the sector the polyobjects are going to appear in. That's perfectly fine. It's just always good map making habit to make your polyobject container or your control sector the exact same values as the sector that your polyobjects are going to appear in. Now I put the controls for the polyobjects on the polyobjects themselves. That is just something that I like to do for consistency in the way Doom plays. Player goes up to a door, pushes on it, and it opens. But you could also do this with the switch. You just put a little switch in here. Let's go ahead and put one in here for the sake of showing you. And we're going to actually, let's go ahead and just delete this sector so we got solid lines. And this line here is going to be, let's go ahead and put a switch on it. Switches. Let's put a nice computer one on there. Lines. Put a nice little computer texture on there. Okay, now our switch is set up. All right. Now, take this line, properties, Polyobject door slide, Polyobject number 1, turbo, movement angle, 124, 6 seconds. Repeatable action when player presses use. Now, you'll notice that I put Polyobject number 1 in there. It's only going to move Polyobject number 1. However, Polyobject number 1, when it moves, it's going to move too because we set up the mirror function in the start lines for the Polyobjects. So whatever 1 does, 2 is going to do the exact opposite of. Okay? And that's all set up and ready to go. So let's run the map, see how it does. The same thing can be done with a player walks over line or monster walks over. It doesn't really matter. Any line cross or any line push that can operate any other function can operate Polyobjects. Let's go ahead and put one in there. Vertices. Draw my line. All right. Line. Polyobject door slide. Polyobject number 1. Turbo. Movement angle. 124. 6 seconds. Repeatable action when monster or when player walks over. Run it and watch what it does. And it opens. So Polyobject can be controlled any way that any other object in Doom can be controlled. We could set a tag for when monster walks over, or a control function on that line that says when monster walks over, and it would do the exact same thing. Let's say an imp or a pinky or whatever walked over it, or even a floating monster, if they passed over it would activate it. Or you could set it up to where if a projectile went over it or whatever, you could set that up to do pretty much whatever you want it to do. Okay, and that's pretty much the basics on how you make a Polyobject. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you're able to make these yourself. This has been Barefoot Map Maker. If you like the video, please leave a like, and of course, please subscribe. Thank you.